When talking about the Middle East, the most common mistake made by the West is to treat the conflict merely as a matter of power, oil, borders, and military balance. All of that matters, of course, but that's not all there is to it. There is a religious and cultural layer that part of the Western elite prefers to pretend doesn't exist, whether out of ignorance or intellectual cowardice. The problem is that, while much of Europe and the Western Hemisphere have come to interpret politics and war in an increasingly technocratic, secular, and bureaucratic way, an important part of the Middle East still operates on theological, identity-based, and civilizational reference points as well. This changes everything, because when one side sees the conflict only as a strategic dispute and the other sees it as a sacred duty, as historical memory and religious destiny, war stops obeying only the cold logic of cost and benefit. And this is where the issue of extremism needs to be consciously addressed. The real problem of Islamic extremism is one of the greatest challenges of the 21st century, but calling it just extremism sometimes softens what is truly at stake. Because in many cases, it's not about accidental deviation from tradition, but rather about movements that claim quite ancient textual, legal, and cultural foundations. This doesn't mean that every Muslim thinks this way. That would be a false simplification, but it does mean that certain violent forms of rhetoric don't come out of nowhere, nor can they be understood only as a product of poverty, colonialism, or social exclusion. Because in various currents of political Islam, there is a doctrinal discourse that allows war to be turned into a sacred duty and chaos into a redemptive omen. The Iranian case makes this particularly clear. In Shi'ism, which structures the official religion of the Islamic Republic of Iran, the so-called hidden Imam, or Mahdi, is a central figure who will return in the end times and will take part in the events related to the final judgment. And this expectation is not just a folkloric detail, it is embedded in the traditions, institutions, and languages of legitimacy of the Iranian regime. Recent studies on Iran show precisely how the political legitimacy of the Islamic Republic remains strongly linked to the idea of a divine authority. It was in this environment that Mahmoud Ahmadinejad gained attention for using narratives that caused discomfort among the high-ranking Iranian clerics, who saw this as political manipulation and an indirect challenge to the very order of authority of the regime. In other words, even within the Iranian order, Ahmadinejad was perceived as someone who exaggerated this messianic language. But the central point remains. He was not operating in a vacuum, he was exploiting a symbolic ground that already existed. That's why the idea that chaos brings God closer shouldn't be treated merely as rhetorical eccentricity. In some revolutionary and apocalyptic views, historical disorder is not seen as an absolute evil to be avoided, but as an acceleration of the end times. And here something deeply connected with the classic European Christian tradition appears. In the Catholic imagination, God tends to be associated with order, hierarchy, logos, and the containment of chaos. But in apocalyptic Islamist currents, collapse can be reinterpreted as purification, as a test, or as a harbinger of redemption. And this changes the strategic logic, because an actor who sees disorder as a metaphysical opening will not always react to the cost of death. What does it mean for an actor who sees disorder, how to react to it? In canonical Sunni collections, such as Sahih Muslim and Sahih al-Bukhari, there are traditions according to which the hour will not come until Muslims fight Jews. And there are versions in which stones and trees would reveal where the Jews are hiding. In one of these versions, the exception is the Gargad tree. This is not a modern invention, it is in the compendiums themselves. The decisive fact is not that every Muslim believes this, but that this material exists, circulates, and can be mobilized and serves as symbolic fuel for anti-Jewish and jihadist movements. And that's why the war in the Middle East can't be understood just in terms of money, but as a geopolitical dispute and above all, a civilizational one. There is an active theological dimension, but it would be intellectually dishonest to stop there, because religious radicalism is not only present in the Islamic sphere. On the Jewish side, there is indeed a real minority group, albeit a very active one, that sees the reconstruction of the Third Temple not as a spiritual metaphor, but as a concrete historical goal. Movements like the Lubavitch Shabbat, which preach not only Jewish messianism but even Jewish racial supremacy, are dedicated to preparing liturgical objects, priestly studies, and symbolic conditions for a future temple. They exist and operate publicly in the government of Israel. And the problem is obvious. Any physical reconstruction of the temple on the mount where the Al-Aqsa complex stands today would explode into a religious war of monumental scale. And Al-Aqsa is not a peripheral detail. Because Jerusalem is home to the third holiest site in Islam, associated with Muhammad's night journey and the Islamic tradition that also preserves the memory of Jerusalem as the first direction of prayer before the Qibla was fixed in Mecca. That's why any sign of change in religious sovereignty, legal status, or devotional use at the site is perceived by millions and millions of Muslims, not as an administrative gesture, but as a direct spiritual attack. The most honest picture is that the West is not caught between Islamism on one side and so-called normal reactions on the other. It is caught between three religious fanaticisms that are contaminating the real power of nations and could lead the world to a nuclear catastrophe, to an unprecedented economic crisis that would make 2008 and 1929 look mild. Serem parques de diversões e uma explosão de guerras civis ao redor do mundo. O primeiro, it's the eschatological Islamism that draws on hadith, martyrdom, holy war, and the defense of Al-Aqsa as a language of legitimation, which I've already mentioned here. The second is radical nationalist Messianic Judaism, which cannot be treated as a conspiracy theory because it is something public and documented. Very strong in Israel, in a religious and political sphere that does not see Jerusalem only as the capital of a modern state, but as the center of a theological redemption, where full Jewish sovereignty, territorial expansion, colonization, and expression over the Temple Mount come to be seen as a sacred duty. And this delusion has institutional consequences. Figures like Itamar Ben-Gvir have moved from the extremist fringe to the very heart of the Israeli government, advocating supremacist positions, confronting the state at Al-Aqsa, and pushing Israeli politics into an increasingly incendiary zone. So it's not just about a few eccentric rabbis. There is an organized movement that mixes religious and ethnic supremacism, territorial expansionism, and state power. And when this group talks about unrestricted Jewish presence on the Temple Mount, about reconfiguring sovereignty over the site, or uses messianic language about national redemption, as well as the right of Jews to enslave other non-Jewish peoples, this is about a group that is objectively playing with the possibility of religious war on a regional scale, even suppressing other Jews who don't agree with them. And the third fanaticism is Pentecostal or Zionist Evangelical, especially in the American and Brazilian spheres, and this should not be treated as a footnote. In many cases, it acts as an external multiplier of Israeli maximalism because a significant part of American evangelicalism. Israel not only for geopolitical calculation but for eschatology, that is, as it is a matter of prophecy, of the second coming, of the restoration of Israel, of Jerusalem, of the temple, of the end times. Research and analyses from the Peel Institute have long shown that American boomer evangelicals tend to be specifically pro-Israel and often link this position to religious beliefs, not just international strategy. So the real problem isn't just that there are religious fanatics. The problem is that these fanatics are occupying the levers of power in nation-states. In the Islamic case, this affects armed movements and ideologized states. In the radical Jewish camp, this penetrates governments, coalitions, ministries, and occupation policy. And in the Pentecostal evangelical Zionist case, this pressures the greatest power on the planet to interpret the Middle East through apocalyptic or biblical civilizational lenses instead of purely estratégicas ou geopolíticas. The consequence is a triple distortion. Diplomacy becomes theology, containment becomes a divine mandate, and compromise becomes spiritual betrayal. The Middle East and the world by extension are not being pushed to the brink just by material interests. It is also being pushed by a perverse convergence of three radical religious groups who hate each other, who don't trust one another, but since they have the same goal, they end up working toward the same end. And when these three religious absolutisms start to orbit around conventional weapons and weapons of mass destruction, state, borders, and war, the result is not armed peace, it's historical combustion. It's not all Muslims, it's not all Jews, and it's not all evangelicals, obviously, but it's the extremists from these three religions. They are converging at high speed, at a crossroads that will produce a disastrous collision because they are taking on leadership positions in nations and they are giving up. They are directing state and government structures in the same direction, From this emerges a truly serious geopolitical issue, when beliefs about the temple, the Messiah, the promised land, the end times, and divine mandate stop being just private convictions and start circulating among ministers, parliamentarians, ambassadors, think tanks, donors, and party leaders. They enter the machinery of the state. From then on, foreign policy ceases to be just a rational cost-benefit calculation and starts to be contaminated by absolutist worldviews. And absolutist worldviews are extremely dangerous because they negotiate poorly, give in poorly, and turn compromise into sin. That's why the situation is more serious than it seems. The West is not only facing militant Islamism, it is also trapped in a web of competing fanaticisms, rival messianisms, and theological instrumentalizations that run through political Islam, radical religious Zionism, and Christian Zionism. None of these groups fully represent their civilization, their religion, or their people. But they all have something in common. When they get close enough to real power, they make wars easier, moderation harder, and compromise more suspicious. The problem in the end isn't simply religion. It's religion armed with the state, with territory, with technology, with lobbying, with sacred memory, and with historical resentment. That's when it stops being just a belief. The great danger in this 2026 conflict isn't just the lack of diplomacy, it's the fact that diplomacy assumes all players want to avoid the apocalypse. What this scenario of the three fanaticisms shows us is that for an increasingly influential segment in power, the apocalypse isn't a risk to be avoided, but a goal to be achieved. And this is serious, because since they believe in this, it means that if nothing major is done, then yes, the risk of disaster will be deliberately increased. Enquanto o Ocidente secular, it insists on treating the Middle East as a chessboard where you win by points, while religious actors, including Western ones, treat it as an altar where you win through sacrifice. In the end, when politics becomes theology, the only way out left is either a miracle or a catastrophe. And historically, catastrophe was usually what arrived first. Thank you all, I hope you enjoyed it, and a special thanks to Semnotaten and Bruno M. Fumagalli. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and share the video with everyone you know to help Geopolitica Mundial simply keep existing. Your support is more important than you think, and if you really like the Geopolitica Mundial channel, consider becoming a member. By becoming a member, not only do you get early access to these videos, but even more importantly, you'll have access to several exclusive series for members, as well as exclusive live streams with me. Best regards and see you in the next video.